We are united in diversity. We are very heterogeneous in our opinion.
We are doing this in our open democracies, discussing this all open and loud, and I'm not for that.
What is European Union? What is freedom? How we learn together.
The obvious question is, what is the EU doing? What is our plan?
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Politico's Competitive Europe Summit. I'm Joanna Roberts. I'm the Senior EU Policy Editor at Politico, and I'm very pleased to see you here this morning. Now, we're meeting at a moment when Europe's under tremendous strain. There's an ongoing war on our doorstep, a new conflict in the Persian Gulf, reshaped trade relationships, including a new deal last night, and an evolving relationship with the United States. And this volatility is reshaping European politics and policies. Across the Atlantic, Washington is doubling down on industrial policy and export controls, while growing transatlantic friction spills into trade. To the east, Russia's war in Ukraine and the new war in the Middle East are rewriting Europe's energy map and forcing hard choices for the defense and energy policies. Competitiveness is no longer a technocratic theme. It's a lens through which Europe is deciding how to protect its prosperity and its security. And that's the backdrop for our discussions today. How far to simplify rules for businesses, how much risk to accept in trade and security, and how to balance near-term relief with long-term green and digital ambitions. This morning, we'll start with a discussion on simplification and ask whether deregulation can really unlock growth without eroding the standards and the benefits that underpin Europe's role as a regulatory superpower. We then turn to the EU's ambition to create its own industrial champions, before digging into the future of the single market and enlargement as both a geopolitical and competitiveness strategy. This afternoon, we're going to move sector by sector through the core battlegrounds of competitiveness, economic security, health, energy, defense, digital, and automotive. From de-risking critical dependencies and managing trade wars, to making energy cheaper and cleaner, to sustaining Europe's edge in pharma, AI, and manufacturing, each session will test whether the EU is ready to move from strategy to execution in a far more hostile world. Now, throughout the day, we'll have a series of panels and interviews with policymakers, experts, academics, and industry leaders, including the Energy Commissioner, Dan Jorgensen, the Enlargement Commissioner, Marta Kos, and the Defense Commissioner, Andrius Kubilius. Now, before we kick off, I want to thank our partners for making this summit possible. Our leading partners, FPA and Roland Berger, and our presenting partner, Google. At Politico, we love a good debate, so please do share your thoughts with us on platforms like X, Instagram, Blue Sky, LinkedIn, and others, using the hashtag #PoliticoCompetitiveSummit. Now, some sessions are going to include Q&A for our audience here in the room, and our moderators will let you know when those Q&As will take place, and for those sessions, we'll be coming around the room with roving mics. And then during our networking breaks, our reporters and our Politico Pro staff are in the corridors to connect with you, and you can explore our partners' installations and meet fellow attendees. So, thank you very much for being here this morning. And with that, let us begin our first session on simplification and Europe's new strategy to beat the competition. Let's welcome on stage Marianne Gros, our sustainability reporter, who will moderate this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this panel on simplification, the EU's new strategy to beat the competition. The European Commission is attempting to make good on a promise to EU leaders to radically simplify its rulebook, cut administrative burden for businesses. The point is to reduce cost, make it easier for companies to do business, launch infrastructure projects, and attract investments. But is it working? Are companies better off now that they don't have to report on their environmental footprint? Who is truly benefiting from the simplification drive so far? These are questions we will attempt to answer today. And to do that, I am joined on stage by Heather Grab, Senior Fellow at Bruegel, Philippe Adriaansens, Policy Director at the European Roundtable for Industry, and Lara Wolters, Dutch Member of the European Parliament in the Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats. Thank you for being here. To kick things off, since simplification is about how the EU makes policy, what is one thing you change about how the EU makes laws and implements them, if you could, with a swift action, change things today? Lara, let's start with you.
I think we would need to pause and think about what we're doing. I think that's not happening today. I think that at the moment, simplification is a buzzword, but it's also a buzzword that is quite thin. I think that simplification as a strategy on its own is intellectually disingenuous. I think it's strategically poor. And if we were to make a success of simplification, I think that would start by recognizing that simplification is perhaps a precondition for other things, but not in any way a goal in itself.
Okay. Philippe, one thing you change about EU policymaking to boost competitiveness?
Good morning, and thank you for having us. From the point of view of the European Roundtable for Industry, the ERT consists of 60 CEOs of the largest European industrial companies. We would like to make it even more sexy to reduce reporting requirements. And rather than calling it simplification or deregulation, it would be better if the EU institutions were very honest about it and called it cost-cutting. We need more rules that aim at cost-cutting for companies. This is the #1 priority for European CEOs since many years. And we all agree and we can all see and feel that energy costs are problematic for European competitiveness, but in our internal studies and surveys, we see consistently over the last years that the complexity in Europe's regulatory framework trumps, as a worry for competitiveness, the energy costs amongst our CEOs.
Heather, what is one thing you change about EU policymaking to boost competitiveness?
I would set the time horizon further out. We are entering a period of really harsh conditions for the European economy, with energy prices that are going to remain sky high for fossil fuels. It's unlikely they're going to come down rapidly after what's happening in the Middle East, of more and more competition from China based on longer-term thinking. China has had a long-term plan for going into renewables and electric vehicles and so on, which is executed while we've been sitting on our hands around many of these issues. And also where the US is going to remain an unpredictable ally, certainly for the next few years. So to think about these kinds of circumstances, we can't just think about how do we maintain the existing incumbent industries and subsidize them to continue with their existing incumbent business models. We've got to be planning for how can the European economies, including the companies, be competitive in 5 years' time and 10 years' time. That means investing in what will give us energy security, energy independence, which is renewables, investing in upgrading our infrastructure to cope both with increasing sabotage from hostile actors, but also with climate impacts, which are coming whether or not Putin invades. Right? Climate impacts are coming anyway, and making our economy a lot more resilient. We absolutely cannot be competitive if we are constantly vulnerable to disruption from everything from the oil markets to tariffs. Now, tariffs we can't do too much about in the short term, but we can do a great deal more to insulate our economy from the toxic dependencies which both Draghi and Letta pointed out in their reports.
Okay, so pause the deregulation drive, rebrand the deregulation drive, change the perspective. Now, we've mentioned cost-cutting already. The European Commission claims that the simplification packages, the so-called omnibuses that have been presented so far, will save up to 15 billion in costs for companies. Heather, have you crunched the numbers, double-checked the calculation? Do you think this estimate is legit?
I haven't crunched the numbers on this. There's quite a lot of controversy around these numbers, including in the European Parliament, which I'm sure Lara can talk about. What we have looked at is some of the second-order effects, though. So, for example, I think it's very interesting, the evidence that quite a lot of companies are complying with, for example, the sustainable finance rules, even if they've been excluded from the scope of those rules by the first omnibus. And the reason for that is because they need that data available for investors. They need to be able to make an investment case. They may also need that data for their clients, who are the larger companies who have to gather that data. So if you want the whole supply chain to be covered, then more companies have to report, and that's why you see quite a lot of voluntary reporting. But the problem is that with a framework which has been changed before it even came into effect, in the case of CSRD, for example, it's created more costs because it wasn't clear what companies had to do. The front runners who were getting prepared got punished. The laggards who hadn't prepared were rewarded. And that makes many companies more reluctant to invest themselves in what they will need to attract the investment to attract the capital from the outside. So I think that there's a real problem with trying to calculate simply on the basis of de-scoping. This is really a matter where we need to be thinking about where our whole sector is going to go and what kind of reporting is needed for those sectors. And the problem, I think, especially with the sustainable finance omnibus, is that it didn't actually reduce the amount of reporting required for companies in scope. It didn't actually simplify. It simply took a lot of companies out of scope.
Now, so, I mean, there's many things that you've just said that we need to pick up on, but again, on this point of cost-cutting, now if we look at what the Commission is proposing in these files, it's, as you say, reducing the number of companies that are in the scope of the laws, reducing the frequency of reporting obligations, extending implementation timelines. Philippe, are you satisfied with that, or are the companies that your institution represents satisfied with that and its ability to lead to cost reduction?
The answer is a diplomatic yein.
That doesn't count.
It's
a yes or no question.
It's an improvement. And everything that aims at cost-cutting and reducing reporting requirements and at simplifying rules and procedures for companies is a step forward. Is it good? Is it enough? By far, no. And the European Council mentioned that in their conclusions at the end of last week. They're asking 27 heads of state and government are asking that the co-legislators agree on all the omnibuses by the end of this year. Your original question was, how can we quantify the costs? And is this 15 billion euros a good estimate? It's unfortunately very tricky and difficult to really go and measure what the added additional cost is of every small report that co-legislators have added often in the legislative process in the past years. Now good, we should maybe try and calculate it, but it goes without saying that every small report and every additional cost is like a death by 1,000 knives to a company and to Europe's economy overall. What we should do is not only look at the individual costs of reporting, but at the outcomes. And we see very low growth in the EU for the last 10 years. Look at Deloitte's report that was published together with the Antwerp Industrial Summit in early February, and all the statistics there, the benchmarks of how the European economy is performing in comparison to China, the US, India, is very worrisome. And therefore I believe, and ERT believes, and the entire business community in the EU believes, that further measures are needed for simplification.
I mean, I don't know that The entire business community agrees with that. There's quite a few companies that have warned against unnecessary burdens created by the simplification agenda because there's this back and forth on laws that had just been introduced, and they're saying that this kind of inability to plan ahead because of regulatory uncertainty could be damaging to business growth. So, Lara, perhaps you have an opinion on this idea and this, whether the Commission's cost reduction expectations are legitimate.
Well, I think, first of all, to say that I, as a social democrat, but as a member of the European Parliament in general, wouldn't trust individual European companies to go and determine what the public good is. I think, as Heather very rightly pointed out, we are in a pivotal time. The world is on fire currently, and what we need is true leadership to deal with that. And what we've got is a report by Mario Draghi that gives us important homework and that tells us what to do. And what he doesn't say is, and the only thing we need to do is cut costs for businesses across the board and simplify rules. What he does say is some very, very, very tough things need to be done. And for those tough things, what we need is political will. And I heard you say that the EU Council said that before the end of the year they want agreement on all omnibuses. Well, they can want all they want. They can tell us all they want. But what I would like to see from the European Council is for those leaders to get into a room together and to truly take decisions on what our energy future should look like, what a real 28th regime should be, what industrial policy in the future should look like. And none of those things are happening. What is our fiscal future? How can we make sure that as Europe that we invest together and that we do it strategically? None of that is happening. What is happening instead is them saying what we're going to do is cut the rules so that we don't need to crack any tough nuts that require, of course, importantly, ceding autonomy. So I would like those people to go and sit in a room together in Antwerp, and instead of coming out with a one-pager that says, let's just cut costs and trust that our companies, who are, of course, protecting their narrow interests, will do something great for the public good, I am not buying that.
So we're not prioritizing the European Commission and the EU is not prioritizing the right steps here. Maybe Heather, Philippe, you want to respond to this?
I think it's very important to look at what Draghi said in his 400-page report, which was prepared with a big team of economists over a long period of time, and he really looked at many aspects of the European economy. And he stressed energy costs must come down and the need to align policies so that decarbonization and energy security are delivered at the same time. And that's something that we're now seeing with a massive increase in energy costs. We'll be paying perhaps 24 billion more for gas because of the spike in prices, because we may be in a very uncertain energy market for some time. He also pointed out the need to align policies to ensure access to capital. So there's the 28th regime, there is progress being made on that, but also there are plenty of other obstacles to scaling up firms. He pointed out the need to invest in innovation, that really, his famous 800 billion euros a year needed in innovation. And I think we should recognize the link between regulatory certainty and innovation. That there's plenty of evidence that firms innovate in response to clear regulatory frameworks. So things like car safety standards led to innovation in the car industry. Fuel reduction standards led to fuel efficiency standards led to innovation as well. But those need to be set out in a framework that companies can trust, so that they can invest in the right things, and they're not having a constant flip-flopping and uncertainty. And I think the other key thing, just coming back to the legislative process, is that it's actually very important to have impact assessments before overhauling legislation. Now, there were impact assessments put forward in the initial legislation, but the first batch of omnibuses did not have impact assessments. So how do we know what kind of an effect they're going to have? So I think there's a lot that could be improved in terms of methodology of having this omnibus process. And finally, the other thing Draghi really stressed is how regulation is implemented at national level. That when member states gold plate regulation and when they put an unnecessary burden on companies in the way that they decide to implement it, when auditors ask for more than is strictly required by legislation, that puts a burden on companies as well. And those issues were not addressed through the omnibus process.
So we'll have time to look into this question of impact assessments and, better regulation coming from the Commission. But Philippe, I want to get your reaction on this. Is there a gap between the instructions that Draghi gave and what the business community expects?
Draghi warned very clearly for a slow agony of decline. Draghi and Letta have very clearly put a finger on the wound of the regulatory complexity in the EU. So yes, simplification is, cost-cutting is one of the most important things that Europe can do to regain growth and also improve our energy sector. Nowadays, many of the innovations on energy and on AI are happening not in the EU. They're happening in China, in the US, even in the Middle East. That report from Deloitte points, amongst others, to the fact that the EU struggles to deploy infrastructure at the required pace. Our grid investments and the electricity grid are lagging behind China, amongst others because of the long waiting times for connection queues. It's also longer in the EU than in the US. Sometimes it can take 7 to 10 years for certain projects or facilities to be connected to the grid, to electrify. So permitting and administrative procedures are holding us back. I would recommend to everybody in the room the book of Abundance by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson. They describe in the US how too many rules and procedures are slowing down innovation, affordable housing, and even the build-out of railway infrastructure. But Europe is sick in the same bed, as we say in Dutch, and has all these problems in itself as well, and we need to tackle these urgently.
But I mean, other jurisdictions have looked at the EU as an example. For example, on sustainability reporting or environmental disclosures, they're now looking at what we had implemented and thinking how can they use that example, adapt it to their national context and introduce environmental disclosure legislation, and that's not stopping China from innovating. So, I mean, forgive me for giving a bit of a caricature here, but are you saying CEOs could be innovating, but they're losing time filling in documents about their environmental footprint?
Companies indeed decide on where they will put their R&D budgets or where they will hire more staff, depending, amongst others, and in a very high priority order, how fast they can get a return on investment. And for the moment, it's very lengthy, all these procedures in the EU. So yes, including European CEOs with their heart in Europe, with their education in Europe, with their families in Europe, find it often better for the company, also for new innovation and for energy, to invest elsewhere outside of the EU. And we have to make ourselves more attractive in the European Union. What other jurisdictions do, including China, to improve on their competitiveness, is to build their single market. We often think that China is good at planning their energy and their innovation, and that they subsidize. They do to a certain extent, but China has a deliberate policy to unify their single market, to do away with local protectionism, to do away with market segmentation, to have more labor circulation and capital flows within China. They do that because that can then give them the economies of scale. That's what we should learn from China and from other economies, to become more competitive and more lean in our regulatory environment.
I see you want to comment.
For the state, then.
Lara, please.
No, the difference with China being, of course, that in China there is a large role for the state, and there is direction and there is vision. And that is not to say that we should now all go and take example of China. But I think what is interesting is, again, that business is taking what it likes from the Draghi report to plead for things that it has wanted all along, which is essentially cost-cutting, deregulation. But none of those things truly have vision. And if we do talk about China, if we do talk about the longer view that I think both Heather and I were talking about by saying things like we need to pause and we need to think about the longer term future, then I think those are things we need to think about. The role for the state in this industrially important moment. Where is it that we want to go, and what does that mean for state direction or for the EU taking a lead in that? The pooling of things like research and development. Are private business interests, are they going to lobby in favor of that? Probably not. Competing with others on national markets. Are companies going to be in favor of that for the greater good? Probably not. The EU picking winners potentially, now with some caveats here, but let's say that we make European investment plans that look at merit on its own. Would companies that at the moment are doing well in their national markets, would they be in favor of that? Probably not. And so I think, but I think that what's important is, again, there is a narrow interest from companies in Europe, and we need to take concerns seriously, but I don't think that we need to be looking to those companies for leadership on the wider picture. And that absolutely needs to come from European member states, and it needs to come from the European Commission. And I understand that Ursula von der Leyen is in a bind because there's only so much she can do before she's being told that she's overstepped, and there's only so much you can do with EU competences that are limited. But what needs to be done is a serious conversation about what Europe truly needs, and not just picking low-hanging fruit and pretending that it's strategy.
This is why I like talking about simplification, because it brings us into this existential debate around federalism in the EU. Heather, I see you nodding. What do you think about the role of the state in this debate?
Well, the role of the state is to think longer term about what are the conditions that companies are going to face, and what are going to be the needs of society. And I think one of the things we've got to face in Europe is our weaknesses vis-a-vis China and the US. And one of our key weaknesses is that we're a resource-poor continent, right? We don't have fossil fuels, right? We don't have the option of dig baby dig or drill baby drill, right? We can't either do lots more mining or find lots of fossil fuels. So we've got to invest in the grids. I agree absolutely with Philippe on that. And grid investment and dealing with the permitting issues, many of which are at local and national level. This isn't just an EU matter. This is absolutely vital. Look at how Spain has been much more insulated than other countries because of from the conflict in the Middle East. Because of the investments already made, we need to go much further in that direction. But we're also poor in many other resources. We're poor in terms of critical raw materials that we know. That's where clean trade and investment partnerships are important. But we also need to look not only at the supply side of our very import-dependent economy, but also the demand side. How can we reduce the toxic dependencies which make us vulnerable both to the weaponization of the dependencies by, say, for example, China or even the US? Our dependency now on US LNG doesn't look so smart as it used to. And also our dependency on all kinds of resources which we have to buy in. Now, we could become much more productive in how we use the resources that are here already. And I would like to see our definition of competitiveness in the EU contain a lot more about resource efficiency. It's not in, for example, either of the definitions of competitiveness which are currently in the European Parliament. Neither the MV Committee nor the IMCO Committee definitions of competitiveness really talk about resource productivity. But it's really key. Now, Enrico Letta, in his report, talked about the way moving to a more circular economy in Europe would be the fastest way to reduce the risks associated with dependence on authoritarian regimes, fragile supply chains, and commodity price volatility. Now, those are all things which are largely beyond our control if we continue with thinking, okay, we're just going to keep going with our current linear economy and not change anything. We've now got to recognize where our comparative advantage will lie in the future. And that's where I think the role of the state comes in, because it may not be in the interests of an individual company or even a whole sector to invest in the conditions of the future when they can make money in the conditions of now. But that's not going to be in the interests of society if they're then coming with the begging bowl to their government saying, please give us subsidies because we've been outcompeted by, for example, China, which has developed, much more effective electric vehicles because we didn't invest in something which would have made us less dependent. And so I think this issue of how do we move towards a much more resource-efficient economy which reduces those dependencies and invests in Europe becoming the source of the most durable, reliable, resource-efficient products of the future. That's the future competitiveness we should be thinking about now.
And Philippe, the European Roundtable for Industry represents groups like Schneider, Eni, L'Oreal, like big companies that are still going to have to report on their sustainability credentials because they're large enough to still be in the scope of the new updated versions of the rules. And I feel like in the public debate on this topic, there is often a political will to oppose environmental protection or the climate and economic growth and competitiveness. Give us a perspective of what the conversations look like between your members. Is that really what they believe?
Well, let me maybe recalibrate that. We, as large European industrial companies, we love to compete on sustainability. We all are very happy with the Paris Agreement and would like global warming to be reduced, if possible, to less than 1.5 degrees Celsius. The best way to do that is to become more competitive, to do cost cutting, to make sure that our companies, from steel to aluminium to chemicals to cement to petrochemicals, can innovate here in the EU, can invest here in the EU into upgrading their facilities, that they can connect to the grid. In order to do that, in order to move towards more electrification, in order to decarbonize faster than China currently does, we have to reduce the number of reporting requirements, because a lot of the reports under the taxonomy are not being used. I have been in the rooms with CEOs and with CFOs of our largest companies, and they do not get questions from investors on the taxonomy reports. Also under the CSRD and the ESRS, there are a lot of data points that need to be reduced. If you don't do that, reducing the data points and the number of reports that companies need to file, including for sustainability, because they want to file reports on sustainability, they want to make it transparent to investors how Mercedes and BMW are competing against each other to move towards less emitting vehicles. But what they need to do in the EU is make sure that the number of staff that companies need to hire to comply with all the requirements and to fill in the reports is reduced. Because currently, according to the Deloitte report, the EU has to have, in the EU companies, there needs to be senior staff 11 times more than in China in order to be able to comply with all the legislation. And that is not healthy for our decarbonization efforts.
Now, Lara, you worked on the negotiations for this first omnibus that looked at sustainability reporting. And for those of us like me who follow the file very closely, your decision to quit as co-rapporteur was a dramatic turning point in the negotiations because it illustrated the collapse of the centrist coalition in Parliament on this file. In hindsight, would you have done anything differently, and do you consider this a failure of your group to see the negotiations through all the way?
We were entering into a very different topic all of a sudden, but happy to provide the Brussels audience with a bit of drama. I think most drama these days is coming out of Washington, so happy to oblige. No, I don't think things could have been done differently because, quite frankly, we've got a very large group in the European Parliament that at the moment is still too keen on working with the extreme right to get its ideas through Parliament. And no amount of political goodwill or ratio or pleas to cooperate, because at the end of the day, this is a matter of the public good. All of these questions are extremely important for our economy, but no amount of attempting that worked. And I think that in itself is something that we can talk about all day. I think that is an extremely dangerous development for Europe. I think the largest group in the European Parliament cooperating with parties that actively want to undermine our stable institutions, our stable regulatory environment, the rule of law, individual liberties, and all those things that we hold very dear, is something that should make the EPP pause. I also think that there's a lot of members in the EPP that do not want to work like this, but I think that we're dealing with a group that has very, very strong and centralized leadership, and I think that for individual members who are unhappy with the strategy of working with the extreme right time and time again, these are tough times. And I think that on the omnibus specifically, I think that what happened was tragic. I won't repeat what I said in the beginning about what Mario Draghi says versus what is happening at European level, but simplification being our strategy is laughable, quite frankly. And it's even more laughable if the proposal, the first proposal that came out, was a flawed proposal. It was a proposal that was rushed through in a process later, of course, named maladministration by the European Ombudsman. It was a process in which civil society and others were shut out. It was a process in which things were done on which there was consensus that it wasn't the right thing. I heard Philippe talk about data points in CSRD. Fully agree. I think there was consensus on that, but that's not what happened.
Yeah,
the Commission didn't take a moment and say, hey, what are those data points that are being reported on that aren't necessary, and how come that companies feel that they need to over-report, and how can we make sure that that isn't done? But instead what was done was scrapping entire groups of companies from the CSRD. That's not smart policy making. That is in no way anything to do with better regulation, and we're all worse off for it.
I can see the time ticking away very quickly. So this point on better regulation is something I'd like all three of you to comment on. The Commission has said that it is looking into changing its own rulebook about making rules, the so-called better regulation guidelines. It wants to react and move faster in the face of geopolitical threats and just a new reality. Is there a risk to the balance of power, and is there a risk to democratic policy making if the Commission changes these internal rules around how it drafts and implements policy? Heather, maybe you want to come in here.
I think the key thing is to look at what is going to be the impact of legislation, and that's where I would like to see more attention in the legislative process. At the moment, we have a quite unwieldy process where the Commission puts forward, its initiative, its draft. Then there's lengthy negotiations with the Parliament, with the Council, in the course of which often very many additional things are put into the legislation which overcomplicate it. Now, that's not to say the Commission has necessarily put forward something perfect in the first place, but it's often easier to add things than to take them away. You have the Christmas tree effect, which everybody who works in Brussels is familiar with, that everybody wants to put their bauble on the tree, and you get a really overdressed piece of legislation. Now, the omnibus process didn't really take baubles off the tree. It simply removed lots of the companies that the tree was supposed to cover. Okay, so that's not going to be a good way to go forward. So I think in looking at better regulation, the key thing is to do a much more solid assessment of what will be the outcomes of this legislation? That is tricky because that can be a trade-off with nimbleness and with reacting quickly. But I think also this idea of moving towards more directives and more regulations rather than directives to also reduce the amount of diversity across the member states in how they implement legislation is also very important to keep the level playing field.
So implementation, Philippe, what do you think? Is there a risk to democratic policymaking here?
We always need to improve the way we make rules. Better regulation, fully agree with that. In particular, a competitiveness assessment should be added to any type of new legislation. I fully agree, it is easier to add things and to remove them. So maybe in the meantime, whilst we are updating in the Commission the better regulation principles, can we make sure that we remove any reporting requirements or additional complexity for which no decent competitiveness assessment or impact assessment was done in the first place? Because nobody has ever tried to really look at how much negative action or impact all the additional layers of complexity and reporting had on companies and on the European economy. So let's be outcome-oriented, indeed, and make sure that we keep the overall competitiveness and KPIs for the performance of the European economy in international comparison into account.
Laura, maybe a final word on this question before we have to move on to the next conversation. Is there a risk to policymaking, democratic policymaking, as a result of this change?
Absolutely. I find it very hard to come to any kind of different conclusion. There is supposed situations of urgency that are being abused in order to very quickly propose legislation. There is the shutting out of dissenting voices in that process. There is a complete lack of predictability. There is the ignoring of a European ombudsman who says this is not the right way to do it. If the Commission was serious about the European ombudsman and what she represents, then the Commission would need to withdraw the omnibuses. And I think most importantly in all of this, all of these things matter. All of these are small slices towards a situation that we do not want. Because I think that on all of these things, abusing situations of urgency, shutting out voices that you don't want to hear, what does that remind us of? Well, I don't need to tell us. And very importantly, I think Ursula von der Leyen talking recently about the new reality and what it means, and in that, basically, not pledging allegiance to the importance of international law, but being extremely flaky on international law, the rule of law, and the importance of that, I think that tells us something too at the moment. And I think we very quickly need to move away from that. And as Heather said, take the long view on all of those cumulative impacts.
Well, all three of you have given us so much to think about today. Thank you so much for your time and for coming. Please join me in thanking our panelists.